20th, 1969. It is said that 500 million people gathered at TV sets around the world to wait for the first Earthling to set foot on the moon. Countless millions more listened on the radio to the voices from the moon.
This is Neil, radio check. Neil, this is Houston, loud and clear. Break, buzz, this is...
Never before had so many people been attuned to one event at one time. The world waited, curious, wondering, aware, like a sleeper wakened in the night by a faraway sound. A moment sensed, more than understood.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now. Neil, we can see you coming. Okay, I just checked. Getting back up to that first step. That isn't collapsed too far, but it's adequate to get back up. Roger, we copy. It's a pretty good little jump. I'm at the foot of the ladder. The LEM footbeds are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. I'm going to step off the LEM. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. C'est un bond en avant gigantesque de l'humanité. He is on the moon at 4 seconds. Cape Canada time, astronaut
L'homme est sur la Lune à 22h50
na Księżycu. O godzinie 4:17 rano, czasu przylądka Kennedy, astronauta Neil Armstrong zeskoczył z ostatniego szczebla drabinki pojazdu księżycowego
从月球登陆器的梯子踏上月球。人類が月面に到着しました。ケープケネディ時間で4時17分。
That looks beautiful from here, Neil. It has a stark beauty all its own. It's like much of the high desert of the United States. It's different, but it's very pretty out here. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston? Neil, yes, we are getting a TV picture. You're in our field of view now. Okay, ready for me to come out? All set. Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter to hop down from one step to the next. You've got 3 more steps and then a long one. Okay, I'm going to leave that 1 foot up there and both hands down about the 4th.
How's everybody doing? Good to see you all here today. Welcome to today's event, and we're so happy to be able to partner with Modernism Week to have an official Modernism Week event here today. I just wanted to take a brief moment to let you know about a couple of exciting things. One, if you didn't see the beautiful Thunderbird car out front, definitely check that out. It is gorgeous. And Mr. Granger is here. Are you in the room? Thank you so much for bringing that out. We really appreciate that. Also today, how many of you, I'm just curious, have been to one of our programs before? How many of you, this is your first time? Oh, that's fantastic. Well, welcome so much. Welcome to the library. We're really thrilled to have you here. And if you haven't yet been to the observatory, maybe you have been to one of our programs, but not the observatory, you are welcome to take a little walking tour out there yourself. And to ask any questions, our astronomer Eric is out there, and he will be out there today until 4 p.m. So that's kind of an exciting opportunity that doesn't happen every day. So we're happy about that. But I do just want to say thank you so much to our foundation and remind people that all of our programs here at the library are brought to you for free. Nearly everything we do is free, and that is because of the hard work of our foundation and the support that comes in through donations. So thank you so much for that. And if you're interested in learning more, you can ask any employee or you can check out our website. But without further ado, I want to get into introducing today's program. So we're going to ask a question today. We're going to ask, how did envisioning the future, the exuberance of the times, and the all-pervasive space race meld to influence the prescient design aesthetic in the space age era? I have no idea how to answer that question. Thankfully, Mr. Martin McGee does. He is a cultural archaeologist and media producer. He spent years researching the period and collecting its artifacts to advance understanding about the astonishing epoch that bridges the atomic age and the information age. 15 pivotal years where science fiction and science fact intersected to create a weird and fascinating narrative, the seismic juncture of the modern and postmodern that still reverberates today. Today's presentation will highlight pieces that exemplify the unique look of the space age that is inspiring and resonating with our present-day designers. So let me welcome, help me welcome Mr. Martin McGee.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, DJ. All right. Thank you for coming. Can everyone hear me? Okay. How many here, just real quick, I'll ask, had a chance to see the exhibit at the convention center? Okay, a few of you. Unfortunately, it closed yesterday. It was just over the weekend. It was a sneak peek at what I hope will be a museum-level presentation of this period and its design down the road. Maybe even here, who knows, right in Palm Springs. I want to start by thanking the museum, thanking the library for bringing me here for this talk, and thank Aaron and TJ and the rest of the staff for their diligence in making this possible. There's a lot of material I have here. Could probably be 3 or 4 talks easily. I do have some books left over from the exhibition, and this has a couple insightful, I could say, essays, and the entire exhibit that was up at the convention center. So I will have those in the lobby if you're interested. And I also have free posters from the exhibit. And something I thought I'll have at the table outside afterwards. My next door neighbor, some years ago when I was working I'm from Buffalo, New York, and put together an exhibit there that was in a warehouse space and very interactive, and you went through the different chapters of the space age period. And he looked up the etymology, the origins of the term space age, and found that it was from this book by Harry Harper, a British author, just after the war, just after World War II. And I'll just read very quickly what he wrote when he coined the expression space age. So this is, according to my neighbor, the first known use of the term. And he said, "We have had an age of steam power, an age of electricity, and of the petrol engine, and an age of the air, and now with the coming of atomic power," so this is just after the war, remember, "the world should in due course find itself in the space age, and this should be the greatest age of all." So some people have asked, they'll see this on social media, and they'll see the dates, and they'll wonder, what's up with that, because aren't we still in the space age? And yes and no. If you look at it as a design period, a historical period, I bracket it with Sputnik to the last Apollo mission. And I've written about what happened after and what happened before, and that's basically how I bracket the period from Sputnik to the end of Apollo. So let me start. I've got a lot to go through, so I'm going to kind of move quickly here and see if my trusty timer is working. Okay, yes. So I would ask you to hold off any questions. We'll have a brief opportunity for that at the end because I'm just going to keep kind of moving along here through that. So I want to direct your attention to the screen pretty much from this point on and take you back to a very exciting period in our history. Okay, I would show you this because this is interesting. I found this issue of Life poking around in an antique mall looking for old issues, old magazines that had something to do with space age. And this one caught my attention, and it turned out that it was just after Sputnik. And it's essentially a propaganda piece that was put together very quickly on the heels of Sputnik. As you know, that was a huge embarrassment and a real shock at the time that they got the jump on us in space exploration with the launching of Sputnik in October of '57. And I was, you can see this intriguing cover. We've got this air dome over this backyard. And I didn't discover it until I got back home with it, and I was looking at the contents page and the little thumbnail where they tell you what the cover is, and I found out that this was Walter Bird's home in Buffalo. It's just outside of Buffalo in a suburb. And Walter Bird is the inventor. He was a former employee of Bell Aerosystems, which was also based in Buffalo and did a lot of space research. So you might be wondering, like, wow, Buffalo, like snow, chicken wings, Super Bowl losses. Imagine this. In 1957, a very important piece of propaganda, they wanted to show the latest and greatest technology and how advanced we were. And they put Buffalo on the cover. So I was really amazed by that. But his company is still based in Buffalo. It's called Bird Air, and they're an international corporation that puts up those huge domes, those air-filled domes. So now, growing up as a kid in the 60s, I was, of course, enmeshed in the space age. And if you think about your childhood, you realize, if you stop and ponder it for a second, you realize that that's your frame of reference. So you only know what you're experiencing at that time. So you don't really have a grasp on the past or an understanding of what's ahead or anything like that. You're just growing up in that time. So anybody I was born in '57, so the year of Sputnik, I was probably 6 months old. Don't remember it, but when it took place. But I remember as a child that there was this intense push for science education. And some of you of that period who grew up in that time may remember it. And that was a direct reaction to Sputnik. Now this, of course, was the origins of the space race. I show this here. This is a toy from that period, came out in '66, which was an answer to Hasbro's G.I. Joe. This was Mattel's Major Matt Mason. He was the first figure that was this smaller sized doll. He wasn't as big as a Barbie or G.I. Joe. And he wasn't about going to war or combat like G.I. Joe, but he was about rather exploration. He lived on the moon with his buddies, his other astronaut buddies, including Jeff Long, African-American. No women yet at that time. But and he was all about peaceful exploration of the moon as opposed to going to war. And here's... this could be me. I didn't have this toy. I wish I did as a kid. I have it now, and it was on display. I had the space station there. This was on display at the show, but this is probably about my age at the time. I don't know why my mother missed this one for me. My first awareness of design came really, I can say, on a serious level, came living in Japan in the 80s, and my beautiful wife is here for the first time in Palm Springs. She's outside at the table, and we met there. And it was a fascinating introduction to, especially, I'll move forward here, the intensity of Tokyo. I lived in Tokyo for most of the 80s, And then I would draw your attention to the contrast between old and new that was evident wherever you went. I lived on a street where you'd see little shrines that were at the corner of your street, and then behind it would be some futuristic structure. I can say, and maybe others of you who collect or become interested in something can point to a specific point in time where you became, where it took off for you, that moment. And for me, it was seeing this photograph of the Lovell Health House by Richard Neutra, one of the modernist pioneers of modernism, who worked extensively in California and Los Angeles. And I saw this house, and I was amazed to find out it was from the late 20s, and how it seemed that the Jetsons could live there. Here's a more recent photograph of it. It's still there. It's near Griffith Park. And at the time it was built, no one had any familiarity with this kind of structure. This was the first steel-framed residence built in the United States, 1927 to 1929. And when it was completed, there was so much interest in it that it had that visibility on the hill like that that helped, that they charged some amount of money, a quarter or 50 cents or something, to go through it. And I've heard it said that the revenue from that actually covered the cost of the house. So that's something, some food for thought if you're thinking about building a house, if you can make that happen. Okay, then, later on, I of course became fascinated by, this is the Albert Frey's first residence. This is the expanded version in the mid-50s. He kept adding on and added that turret at the top with those bezeled windows there. That was his bedroom. And of course, this, to me, I remember when I first saw it, I didn't even know where it was. I didn't have a reference. It was just seeing an image. And of course, it was right in Palm Springs. And it still looks like something out of a science fiction film. Okay, so now I just want to quickly go through. If I like to look at periods in terms of age rather than, I try to avoid the decade trap. You go, 40s, 50s, 60s, because they're fluid and they don't necessarily correspond to a decade, although the decade certainly is the core of I don't deny that, the core of the period, but they roll across. So that's why I talk about space age 57 to 72. And then you have the atomic age, the jet age. I'm sure there's some other ages we can add, the plastics age, space age. Of course, followed by the information age in the 70s. And today, the digital age. Now, in the beginning, this is an illustration by Chesley Bonestell from Collier's magazine. I think it's 1947 or 48. And this was after the war and the awareness of the V-2 rocket. And of course, we had the scientists that Project Paperclip that came over to the U.S. And so they basically split between half of them going to Russia and half of them coming to the U.S. to develop. They became the core engineers of the space program. So awareness became, especially around rockets, developed after the V-2 rocket missiles that were directed at London. And this is an illustration showing a moon base that that was feared could develop, and then what could happen. So they imagined firing missiles from the moon, and then that's Manhattan there in Brooklyn. Of course, science fiction influence is very important. I probably have some science fiction fans here today. This is Forbidden Planet from 1956, just on the edge of the space age. And you notice the designer here, the set designer, chose to use this kind of George Nelson-esque Herman Miller-style furnishings. Yet this is on a planet far, far away from ours. was very influential artist, Richard Powers. He was a fine artist who found employment doing paperback covers and especially science fiction. He drew in elements of surrealism and other avant-garde art movements to create these fantastic. These are from the late 50s, amazingly, and they look like they're really more a product of the late 60s with their garish colors and their sort of psychedelic graphics. Richard Powers. I have quite a collection. He has an enormous number of paperback books that he did covers for. And I'd love to find an original painting. There again. And this is some other artist, more traditional, just in contrast to show you what was the norm at that time for space science fiction. But Richard Powers, in that sort of more fine art approach to the illustration, had an influence on the movement because it worked well with the fact that the genre was getting more and more respect. Okay, so one thing that I want to point out that's interesting is that you can divide the period between 57 and 72 into fairly convenient 3 chapters. And if you look at it as a narrative, I have basically professionally I have a film background and I work in media, documentary and whatnot. And so I have a love of cinema and film, and I've kind of concocted these aspects that are sort of drawn from that experience. So we have from Sputnik to as we already talked about, last Apollo mission. Okay, so we can identify the early 1957 to 62. This would encompass Sputnik to the Seattle World's Fair, which was the first big celebration, I can say, of the space age. We've got the middle period, 63 to 68. Now, in the early years, we would have had, the emphasis, as I pointed out before, was on science and technology. Became paramount. In education, at that point in time, because of the fear that we were falling behind. Of course, remember, this is the height of the Cold War. So what really makes this period interesting is you've got this converging melding of science fiction and science, and of course, post-war design, and the fact that there was new technology emerging all the time. People were just amazed. I think I can say that at that time it was even more mind-boggling than we can imagine now. It's pretty much on our phones, and it's not that exciting, really. I mean, it's basically apps and websites. But then they were just rolling out so much incredible technology. The middle years, we can say, were dominated by a pop influence. Psychedelia, of course, was very important. I'll talk about that a little later. And then we get into the late years. Now, when I put together the show in 2013, and I laid it out, I started with the atomic age. I had a small display, and then it went into the early years. And I had a lot of space-related, space-inspired toys and whatnot, and graphics and that sort of thing. And then next to it, I had the next room was the influence of the avant-garde. And then past that, I had the mod years in the middle. And then I had the moon years, the moon age in the late 60s and early 70s. And something I noticed just from laying it out, I probably wouldn't have thought of it or noticed it if it hadn't been for that exhibit. But I realized that it sort of followed the baby boom. Because you had the early years, these were kids, and you can just, I have an amazing collection of these record albums and these books that were geared for children from that period. Then the middle years, when you looked at that part of the exhibit, it was all bright colors and candy colored and whatnot, and it represented sort of the teen years of the baby boom. And then the late years, they were young adults. And if you, later on, we'll look at the design and the attire and whatnot, and you can kind of see how the entire period, and it's still being driven by the boomers. You know, I'm of course one of them, because of the impact we had on the 20th century. It's just amazing. Okay, Wernher von Braun was our top scientist, came from Germany, and ran the manned mission, the manned space program for the United States. And he was, there was a series of articles that came out in Collier's magazine in the early 50s, 53, and that he was involved in as an advisor about space exploration. From that, one of Walt Disney's employees became aware of it, and Walt Disney was, of course, a noted futurist, and they teamed up, and this is when he was first concocting Disneyland, and he worked with Wernher von Braun to develop some of the materials that were shown there in films and that were shown on his television show. So we have this interesting, already the basis of where this speculative and fantasy-based ideas about the future are merging with a scientist. He actually wrote a book when he was killing time before he became more active. He was living in Huntsville, Alabama, where they were first devising the space program. And just to pass the time, he wrote his own science fiction book about a trip to Mars. You can look that up and try to find it. Of course, this is an illustration from that series of magazines showing a space station. All during the 60s, we were expecting to get that 2001 type space station. They never delivered on that, and that was going to be the rotating one like you saw in all the movies that created Zero Gravity. And that's a beautiful cutaway view. I think this was, is this Bonestell or a different artist who did this cutaway? Of course, Tomorrowland, so we had Walt Disney played a major role in promoting the idea of living, of the future, speculating on the future and what the future would bring. And something I would point out, a big difference, when you look at that time as opposed to now, was that even though we were at the height of the Cold War and we had the fear of atomic apocalypse happening any day, duck and cover, even though that was the case, there was this strange sort of split that involved looking forward, and it was optimistic. Now, a lot of that had to do with the booming economy. So that played a role, that the future was optimistic and we were going to have a bright future, as opposed to now we tend to dread it. We have this anxiety about the future, but then it was very optimistic. This is a really important part of understanding the period. This is in my collection. This is an unused certificate that you would have gotten if you took the TWA-sponsored trip to the moon at Tomorrowland in Disneyland there in California, in Anaheim. There's a poster for Los Angeles, travel poster featuring the TWA Moonliner. Anybody here have a chance to take that? The Monsanto House of the Future, and this is an article that predates it. This is from a few years before when Monsanto was developing it. And lo and behold, Disney became aware of it, and they teamed up, and they were able to actually build the full-scale version. And it was in Disney for 10 years, from 57 to 67. And millions of people went through it. There may be a few here that had an opportunity to see it. I met a couple of people over the weekend that were there. In fact, they were a married couple, but they had been there as kids separately. They both visited with their parents. And here's a postcard of the house. It's interesting to think that when it was torn down in '67, they had a problem with it. They tried bouncing they couldn't destroy it with the normal means, just a wrecking ball, and they had to cut it up. But it's just a shame that if it was today, this would never happen. They would preserve this, and it would be in the Smithsonian or some university. They could have dismantled it because it was all, of course, plastic, and they could have taken it apart. But it's interesting to think that by 67, a house this crazy far out, this plastic mushroom house, was considered passé, and sort of it wasn't futuristic enough. There's a nice view of it from the peak years. You see the nice waterfall feature underneath. It had a little park. I've been told that the park still exists. It's there. They've maintained the little park, and it's got a statue of Neptune or something. Of course, now this is a very important piece. This is Eero Saarinen's tulip armchair, developed in 1956, first produced for Knoll in 1957, used in a number of science fiction films, and still looks contemporary or even futuristic today. This is over 60 years old. Sputnik, you saw that one. There was a Sputnik music box. Satellites, we've got the magazines and comic books and records, just unbelievable amount of material. This is an early NASA piece. This is a propaganda, I can call it a propaganda piece. It was a public outreach piece to introduce NASA, and surprisingly similar to Star Trek's credo, the final frontier. Of course, this is a souvenir that you could pick up in Houston, and I call this NASA's other division, souvenir production. This is the TP1 by Dieter Rams for Braun, a German industrial designer. Fantastic piece, 1959, one of his masterpieces. It's a record player, radio. Tell me if you have any problem hearing me. That is in the Museum of Modern Art and other collections. And it actually played the record. This is a fairly compact. It was in two parts. There's the radio and there's the phono. It only played 45s. But you see the lever in the middle. And you can see this kind of early post-war German functionalist design that you can see is very inspirational for designs, Apple design, Google, our minimalist designs that we're so used to now. The needle actually popped up from that square when you push the lever, and it played the record upside down like that. Whoop. Did you get me back on track here? Should I just push it? Oh. Hit it? Sorry about that. I think he's trying to catch us up.
Yeah, we'll put it back for you.
That's technology. I don't know if I hit the wrong button. I'm sorry if I did. I've got this set up so he's flipping through it. Here we go. Okay, so he's moving forward on it. Sorry about that. Where were we? TP1. So yes, he also, Dieter Rams, prior to that in 1956, designed this beautiful phono radio cabinet, compact record player radio that got the nickname Snowwright's Coffin because it was the very first stereo. It was revolutionary at the time that had a transparent lid that we're so familiar with now with our stereos, our turntables. And it was the very first time that was developed, and it was like I said, revolutionary at the time. Oh, there we are. Okay, thank you. Let's see. And this is a children's book from, I believe, about 1960. There again, the space station. This is really clever. It's 3D. When you open it up, you go through the different modules of the space station, the different parts. And when you get to the end, it forms a complete circle, and you can look down at a cutaway of the space station. And we've seen that already. Okay, now we're still waiting for our flying car. This is from an advertisement, 1959. This predates Jetsons, the development of the Hanna-Barbera Jetsons cartoon by 3 years. And the ad said, you know, this car, it was electric, you plugged it in, and they're working on it. They're working on it. So they're still working on it. You can see Dad down there and the kid, the boy, the son, and he's got his car parked on the carport. You don't need a driveway. You see that in the corner? Hey, TJ, if there's possibly a laser pointer available, it might be helpful at some point. Here we are at the beginning of the 60s, and the space age and the space program was dominating everything at that point.
Martin, you can use the green line button right under the screen on your pointer. It's a laser.
Oh, the green button? On here? Okay. Oh, there. Great. Okay. Fantastic. I got to get one of these. This is Early Mechanics Illustrated showing, this wasn't developed. This is a prototype or a mock-up of a flat-screen television, a handheld television. We're talking early 60s. When they did 2001, a lot of companies were invited to donate products or develop some prop for the show. And I did see recently that they had this same television in a full mock-up. I mean, it was a real 3D thing. And but it was a color screen. It was a color screen on it rather than black and white. But it was the exact same housing. And here we are, the LAX theme building, 1961. You can see that it's often referred to as Googie architecture, the expression coined by Alan Hess, the author, historian of a lot of mid-century culture. And this is still there, of course. I heard that they've leased it and there's a new tenant. It's been mothballed for a few years, but it's a fantastic postcard image. And you can see the cars with the wonderful fins in the background. I think this is probably, somebody told me they dated the car, and I think it was Charles Phoenix said, I think there's a 64 car there he recognized. Arnie Jacobson designed the Swan chair and the Egg chair, 1957, for a Danish hotel chain, and he did all the product development for the hotel, and this was it still looks I could say contemporary or futuristic today. It's over 60 years old. Elliot Noyes, N-O-Y-E-S, Elliot Noyes, was the chief product designer for IBM, and he had a design unity concept. He was involved with all aspects of developing IBM's products and their branding the company, the corporate brand. And this is his Selectric typewriter that he designed. Of course, this is an amalgam of engineering and design par excellence that's merged here. This was the famous Selectric. A lot of you probably used it. This is the one with the rotating ball and the beautiful aerodynamic shape. And the fact that it was in color, it was available in several colors, red and blue, tan, was revolutionary at the time because no one was, office products were not in color. They were primarily coming out of the gray man in the gray flannel suit era. But now we're moving into the 60s. This is early 60s. Arnie Jacobson, again, this is the flatware for George Jensen, Danish. Still in production. It's always been in production, I understand. And you might recognize this. It was used by the astronauts when they were eating on their mission to Jupiter, to the moons of Jupiter, in Kubrick's 2001. Space World magazine. This is an example of corporate identity, and this is an ad from a magazine that would have, like you just saw there, Space World. And this is the Marquardt Corporation. You can see here their logo, okay, is fantastic with these sort of chevrons for the M with the star. And they're talking about the new concepts for the space age. Mark 15 Years of Progress by Marquardt. And I think I've got a close-up of that, of the logo. Fantastic graphics in those days. Oh, that was in the exhibit. It's in my book that you can pick up in the lobby. An unused award or trophy for rocket development. A scientist's name would have been on there, and that has a beautiful lucite plume with a rocket attached. This is the Acrylica lamp by Joe Colombo, 1961, 62. This is a desk lamp. It's a fairly large piece, and that curved acrylic is prismatic, and there's a fluorescent bulb hidden in the base here, and then the light travels through it to illuminate. And it's a piece I'd love to own. They're still in production by the company's called Olus, and they're very pricey, but wonderful, wonderful piece. It still looks like something that could be used in the current Star Trek series. Oh, and the champagne chair by the Laverne couple, husband and wife team, Laverne, and they had their own product line, and Laverne International. And you can see this is an example. Now this is emulates. Of course, they were influenced here by by Saarinen's pedestal chair, which you can see here as well. But they've added a clear acrylic chair to the design, and this is one of the first examples that I know of acrylic furniture, plastic clear furniture, which played an important part in design in the space age. So this was in the exhibit as well. This is a good example of transitional technology. You can see the angular design, the thin profile. This is a tube radio, though, as opposed to transistor, RCA, Victor, and you can see the influence of the Dieter Rams and the Braun design with its and also the graphics that we saw in the Marquardt advertisement, the Marquardt Corporation. The very logical layout of the design here with the volume and the tuning. Another ad from one of these industrial magazines, and surprisingly similar to the Jupiter 2 that we might be familiar with from the Lost in Space television series. The Firebird 3, GM Firebird 3, this was a fully functional concept car, widely introduced, I can say, at the Seattle World's Fair in 1962. See something here. Okay, I'm going to move quickly here forward. An ashtray that for Oldsmobile. I mean, they branded it with the Oldsmobile logo here, and you can see it. It's this beautiful asymmetrical shape. This was in the show as well, and it's reminiscent of a moonscape. It's a good example of something I wanted to show you. A 50s wine rack, 50s era wine rack, and I'm going to show you in contrast sort of the design aesthetic of the 50s, and then something from the 60s. So there you see the rectilinear, this metal base style here, and then we look at this one here. I don't know the designer of this, but it's acrylic, and then you can see it's the round motif, which was very important in the space age because of the influence of the moon missions and Earth and space and whatnot. It played an important role, and then the material itself and the entire design. There they are together. Then I developed something I call 3D space, an analytical framework for looking at what's really a complex period. It's hard to It's considered by many to be part of the mid-century, but I like to use, rather than the term modern for this period, I like to use the term ultra-modern, which was a very common expression then, ultra-modern. And like I was saying, it's a difficult period to really wrap your mind around because there were so many incredible converging elements going on. So what I have here is developed what I call a 3D space, technological outer space dimension. This would involve all the tech side of things and the astrofuturistic aspects. The psychological inner space, this would involve everything dealing with from the psychedelic movement, and then the renegade science fiction like Robert Heinlein's A Stranger in a Strange Land, which was as popular as any other contemporary fiction at the time. And then the sociological human space, which would encompass everything that we knew in our environment, in our domestic landscape, our products and whatnot. Here's a kitchen from the Miller House, the Irwin Miller House in Columbus, Indiana. And this is an incredible house. It's now open to the public. I strongly recommend you try to get to Columbus, Indiana sometime. It's just an amazing, it's a small town with the most incredible collection of architecture that you could imagine. And this, something like Palm Springs, but even more compressed. And this, you can see the sort of, this is 56, 57, and you can see the influence of science here. It looks like a laboratory. So this would have been very, at the time, very new. Still looks contemporary today. This is Inland Glass Company, and you can see this looks like something from a science fiction film, like a laboratory in a science fiction film, and this would just be how you would heat up some water, you know, in the day. Very elegant, speaks to that period of elegance and Hollywood. Another one of their pieces, triangular glass carafe. The Chemosphere, which is still there in Los Angeles, by John Lautner, the wonderful architect who did the Elrod House up here on the ridge, and the Bob Hope House. This is from 61. It's owned by Bernadette Taschen, the publisher, owner of Taschen Publications, owns this house. Incredible feat of engineering, as you can see, this column. I don't think they could ever build anything, or they would permit anything like this today. This is an example of miniaturization. This is a Japanese phono radio. It's kind of transitional. You can see in the layout and the color choices. But this is a radio. Down here you can see it says P for phono. This actually is a miniature record player. This is at the height of Japanese the transistor radio revolution. So many Japanese companies were marketing to the U.S., and this company was maybe the first, I think, to actually try to incorporate a record player into their design, combine into with a radio, and it played the record with this rubber wheel, and that's the 45 adapter there, as you can see. Amazing piece, and it came in a case. It comes. I have this in the box. I got it from an Italian dealer in the box, and it has the ubiquitous black vinyl case with the tiny perforated holes that goes over it, so it looks just like it's any transistor radio from the period. Another example is Space World. Another example of these industrial magazines that catered to the insiders of the space program, I would say. And here we are, the next 10 years in space. Stranger in a Strange Land, I mentioned that. Very influential book through the 60s. I think came out in, it was 62, 63. And this is interesting. This is from 1953 here, and you can see this is a woman with a rocket pack a jetpack on her back. And I'm going to show you. That's a Bell Aerospace in-house magazine, September '68. And of course, I mentioned before, Bell developed the rocket belt, and was a very popular attraction. Throughout the '60s, they would feature this at county fairs and state fairs and football games. They found out it had very short capacity. It could only take you about the length of 2 football fields, but it worked great for the demonstrations because they'd take off, and just people would be mesmerized and fly across the length of the field and then fly back, and they'd go home. And it was funny. It was just some, like, sort of the guy who was the rocket man who did this is pretty much the same guy. I don't have his name handy in my head here, but he was just somebody at Bell who he said, "Yeah, I'll strap it on and try it." and he became the rocket man, like Elton John talks about. There's a ticket stub from the California State Fair, 1964. And this was a special discount ticket. Bell Aerosystems Rocket Belt Man, direct from New York World's Fair. Then you have Seattle World's Fair, of course, I mentioned that. Very important. They still have their symbolic tower there, still a symbol of Seattle, which was the icon of the fair. And here at TWA, which fortunately has survived, the TWA terminal at JFK, also by Eero Saarinen. And here you have the information desk, which it looks like, out of a science fiction film, it's about late 50s. That's the famous clicker, SC, for Space Command 500. And all you needed was, lower and upper channels, lower and higher channels, and you're on and off. Amazingly, it worked with sonic technologies before infrared, and it worked with chimes that were inside the unit. And so when you press the button, you get a ding. You hear a little tiny bell sound, and this woman came through the exhibit, and she said, "Oh, my grandfather had one, and it broke." And he was able to work a couple of spoons, and she always wondered how he, it was like magic act. He would bang the spoons together, and he got the right sonic tone to change the channels with these spoons. I thought that's, and she was a kid at the time, and she was like, "How does he do that?" There it is. There's an interior of it. You can see the chimes inside, his little tiny bells. So it was sonic. Astronaut Barbie, of course. And I said, a girl astronaut, why not, right? She's ready and willing for her, to be launched. Of course, that's after lunch with Ken. And then this is an example of a Soviet souvenir pen. And this is a rocket base. And, why just pick up a pen when you can launch a rocket? It's so exciting. Here's a nightlight, another Russian souvenir, and you can see the lucite, the acrylic plume here, and then the rocket on the tip. This is a good-sized piece. This was in the show. It's in the book, and you can see the wonderful iconography around the bottom, where there's Lenin and some other highlights of the Russian space program. They were always ahead of us all the way to the moon landing. They were just always ahead. They were the first astronaut and the first orbit and the first woman and the first animal and the first living thing and the first spacewalk and the first 2 ships that docked in space. They were always ahead of us. These are wonderful. I have a collection of these fantastic. These are pins. These are commemorative pins. We didn't see as much of this here, but the Soviet citizens were so proud of their space program, what it represented, the technological advancement of their society, and they would give these out by probably the millions, and they were just wonderful. I have about 40 of them in a case, and this is a Mars mission, and you can see the wonderful graphics, the astronaut profiles, and the different programs. These are all representing different aspects of. This is Mars 4 and 5 here. Stamps. This is one of those tear-apart stamp sheets. It's very nice with the giving you the different examples of the period here. Going to move forward. Wernher von Braun penned this book in 1966, The History of Rocketry and Space Travel. Already, by 66, we had a history. And this is a big, thick book, an illustrated book, and it's a leather cover. You can see the leather and this beautiful graphic illustration. It was sold personalized as a subscription book. Oh, wonderful comic book ad. They actually produced this right here in California. The Aerojet training spaceship. This is an amazing thing that a kid won. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but I can tell you about it at the table. The Jetsons, of course. Iconic symbol of the space age. We're waiting for the live-action version, right? When are they going to do a live-action Jetsons? And somebody else at the show said, and don't forget Johnny Quest. Where's Johnny Quest? Why don't we have a Johnny Quest live-action? And then we get into Timothy Leary became aware of hallucinogenic substances from an article that was in Life magazine in 1957, so right at the cusp of the space age. He was a up-and-coming, promising psychologist, and he was fascinated by the potential for these mind drugs in his work, and of course he became a very controversial figure. This is a book that was, you might recognize the Golden Guide books. When you were a kid, the dinosaurs, the gems, they had one on, the solar system, and this one here was on hallucinogenic plants. Of course, this was caused a bit of an uproar and was withdrawn when parents became alarmed, like, when their the kid came out of his bedroom with the book and said, "Mommy, what's a magic mushroom?" Ken Kesey is up there on top of his bus, his magic bus. The famous author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest traveled across the country, the World's Fair, with his merry pranksters. These are the proto-hippies, the psychedelic pioneers, as you were, made their way to the New York World's Fair. This is in New York City. At the time, no one had any idea that who they were. They looked like a group of circus performers, but they were the first, you could say, hippie freaks. And they get to the 64 World's Fair, and they went to all the corporate pavilions that were there, IBM and whatnot, GM, meandering around on acid, and people had no idea, who these people were, what they were about, and they would play instruments and whatnot, and so it was sort of the first intersection of the hippies and corporate culture. This is 64. Of course, Timothy Leary's psychedelic experience book, which influenced John Lennon to write his Tomorrow Never Knows psychedelic acid rock masterpiece for the Beatles' Revolver album. He took the Turn Off Your Mind, Relax and Float Downstream. He took it right from this book. He discovered this book in the Indica bookstore and gallery in London that he frequented quite a bit in that time frame, 65, 66. There he is on the cover of Life, Richard Avedon's famous photo. You could order a set of the Beatles photos, and from this book, from this magazine, they had a cutout for, this is January 68. And you got 4 posters, one of each Beatle with this iconic 60s psychedelic style. And they were, now they go for $1,000 if you can find them in pristine condition. The Corona chair by Paul Volder. This is another Danish designer. This is from 1962. What's interesting about this is that you can see that he has a steel base here, and you can see these elliptical pieces, this very geometric form, this very organic curving form, And what's interesting is that prior, the first version of this had a wooden base, and he switched to a steel base. And this sort of represents, this is indicative of the switch in materials. From Danish modern, we associate with, in the 50s with wood. And they've moved into so there a lot of their furniture is now absent of any wood. So wood grain is just going out, except for the laminate that they would stick on things, because it still represented quality. Bank of the Future. This is still down there. It doesn't quite look as good as it does. This is in Oklahoma City. Just an incredibly, bizarre building of UFO-shaped components that had you could go down to the vault in this curved, this circular sofa, and you'd go down with one of the managers. He'd take you down to see your safety deposit box, and it descended by elevator. This was they never actually developed the Firebird 4, but it was displayed at the New York World's Fair. André Courrèges, who this is his Paris 64, his space age collection, very influential French designer, fashion designer. He was the one who did all the wild. Here's another example from '66. I mean, this would be avant-garde today. If you saw somebody walking around at a cocktail party. That's a dress that we had in the collection. She's holding the Videosphere television here. That's by Leonard Joseph for Bonwit Teller's Forward Look line, 1965. Space Face. There's just an example of the influence of everything. Everything was influenced by the space race. The Panton chair by Werner Panton. Obviously Werner Panton and Joe Colombo are the most important space age designers primarily in the 60s. This chair was first devised, you probably all know this form, in 1960, but they couldn't create it. He wanted to create a single chair from plastic, but they didn't have the technology until '67. So it was actually introduced in '67. Pop culture, of course, pop art was very influential. This is at this point it was becoming extremely popular. Batman had launched in '66, and they had a whole wonderful article about Andy Warhol and all the other pop artists. The Marina City in Chicago. This is the Goldberg is the architect. Still futuristic today with its scalloped 65 floors, 20 floors of parking here, and the scale-up balconies, circular apartments with views all around Chicago. This is also, it was completed in '64, Lost in Space. You can see the influence of you saw the earlier Space World astronauts. Of course, the silver. Silver was an important color. Black, white, and silver became the palette of the future as far as color scheme in the '60s. And of course, Star Trek, Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. Here we have Mr. Spock, who I dedicated my book to for the exhibit. And this is, of course, Nurse Chapel and Dr. McCoy in Star Trek. And you notice here, this is actually a selection of salt and pepper shakers, Danish modern salt and pepper shakers that Roddenberry had requested for one of their episodes. When they came back with the salt and pepper shakers, he said, these are so far out. We can't use these because nobody will recognize them as salt and pepper shakers. He said, but take them down to props where we'll use, these will become McCoy's instruments. And I found actually 2 sets at flea markets and whatnot of this. I don't know who they were made by, but they're the same ones, and they would just add the sound effect, and that's all you needed. And it was just a salt shaker. There they are. These are actually more. That's a bad color example. They're more silver aluminum. That's something I had in the show that's really fantastic. It's an illuminated bridge model, and this is all a tiny little model that is illuminated. This is current, recent, but somebody souped up the model with these add-on electronics, aftermarket electronics, and these lights and screens move. I mean, it's an amazing piece. This is the sculpted chair by Chromecraft. This was introduced in '66 and was used as a prop in Trouble with Tribbles, the Trouble with Tribbles episode, and I believe a couple other episodes of the original Star Trek. Wonderful form, futuristic, with this reminiscent of the unicorn base that by Vladimir Kagan. We had a rare example on display at the show in red. We believe it was an originally requested one-off red version. Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick in 2001, he teamed up with Arthur C. Clarke, one of the top science fiction writers of the time, to develop what is considered one of the masterpieces of science fiction film. And the Jin line of furniture that was by Oliver Morg, French designer, 1965, was used as props in the Hilton Hotel lounge scenes in the film. You probably remember these. So this is 3 o'clock. Okay, that tells me we got to move forward fast here. Okay, a toaster. Thin line toaster by a single slot toaster here, you can see. And what we've got going on here is a push button. So it's Jetsons influenced. You push the button, no lever. Yep, push button toaster. And the beautiful single line. They've taken the two slots and put them parallel to form this beautiful thin profile. So this is a Japanese Super 8 camera. That is looks like out of a science fiction prop department. Incredible miniaturized record player. You can see this almost looks like Apple 10 years from now. This lid goes on top here, and you can see the corresponding. That's the tone arm. This is a tiny miniature record player. The famous Cartel piece that everybody knows. Acrylic example of another acrylic is a magazine rack. Paper Dress, 1966. Scott was the first company behind that, and a lot of imitators. This is Frigidaire's. You can see this crazy space age influenced advertisement. A bathroom, very similar to some 2001 set. This is a bathroom. There's the sink, the bathtub. There's a toilet over there. I threw this in because it's near my hometown. This is 1966. I forgot the architect at the moment. This is the Toronto City Hall. I toured this as a kid. They took us on a field trip, and this is where they have of course, with their auditorium for their city council, and it's a wonderful plaza here. And then this is a skating rink in the winter, and a reflecting pool in the summer. This is an example of op art influenced. This is just a record case that would be coveted by a teenager back in the '60s. They did a whole series of those op art dresses with flowers, and there we got the op art influenced fashion. This is by Rudy Gunrick, the developer, the guy behind the topless bathing suit. This dress here featured in this ad, and this is PVC vinyl inserts. This would be, I dare to say, would be pretty avant-garde today if you wore this to a party. Of course, the ball chair by Aero Arneo. This is from a science fiction film still. A very important piece because it represented the fact that you had this interior that was almost a spaceship capsule-like. How about that one? Everything was influenced. Expo 67, the interior of Buckminster Fuller's iconic geodesic dome. Ara Arnio, a few years later, developed the bubble chair. And what he did here was he suspended it. Now we're hanging it, and it's a transparent chair, like his ball chair. Dieter Rams, a lighter from 1968. It still looks like a science fiction prop today, 50 years later. The famous, there's one up in Idlewild, the famous UFO. I stayed in one. This is actually a photo I took that was a vacation home you could rent, no longer available. Barbarella, Jane Fonda. Whoa, sorry about that. Can't go back. Oh no. Oh boy, I'll do okay. That was my fault. Can you fast forward it? Well, it's a big recap. Didn't mean to do that. I don't know if we can catch it up and you have to stay for... Well, we're going to have to close up there. I would just, like I said, we're out of time anyway. I had a lot more to show you, but it's just too difficult to move through it as quickly as I needed to. But if you have any questions, I'll take a couple now. Any comments? Yes?
Where'd you get your shirt?
Right in Palm Springs. Yes, I was here in May talking to some of the museum people about the potential of this, and they had the Tiki festival going on, the big Tiki celebration, and I went over to the hotel, the Caliente Tropics, and this woman was selling mostly Hawaii, Tiki themed, but she had a Star Trek themed one, and so I got it right here, and I thought I'd just wear it again. Anyone else? All right. Thank you so much, and I appreciate it. I'll step out and be in the lobby if anyone's interested. Like I said, I have a few more copies of my book from the exhibit at the convention center.